Welcome back to our series on books that may not be on your radar, but should be. These are books, many of them are out of print, many of them were published decades ago. But these are books that have been instrumental in my own spiritual journey and overall biblical worldview. And so I want to share them with Dojo readers. Today, I want to tell you about Money, Sex, and Power by Richard Foster. This book was published in 1985, and it got republished later as The Challenge of the Disciplined Life, Christian Reflections on Money, Sex, and Power. I don't know why they switched the title. This title puts me to sleep, The Challenge of the Disciplined Life. Money, Sex, and Power, that'll grab your attention. And this book did grab my attention. I read it probably back in college, maybe late high school, early college. It is phenomenal. So I want to show you a little bit from it, what it's about, give you a couple of quotes, and then my thoughts on why you should read this book. Now, like I said, it's been republished in paperback, Challenge of the Disciplined Life. Now we're going to be looking at the original version, but the content's the same. It literally just got a new title and a new cover. The newer volume also doesn't have this sweet late 70s headshot of Richard Foster. If you don't know Richard Foster, though, he wrote Celebration of Discipline, Prayer. He edited the Renovare Spiritual Formation Bible. He's done a lot in the work of the spiritual disciplines and the spiritual life. And so in Money, Sex, and Power, he talks about these three things in the world: money, sex, and power. And the book is broken up into those three parts. So after a first introductory chapter on kind of how to approach these topics as a Christian, then part one is on money. And there's 4 chapters: the dark side of money, the light side of money, the kingdom use of unrighteous mammon, and the vow of simplicity. Then part 2, sex. Sexuality and spirituality, sexuality and singleness, sexuality and marriage, and the vow of fidelity. And then part 3, power, destructive power, creative power, the ministry of power, and the vow of service. So after each one, he looks at the issue and then looks at a historic Christian vow, a monastic vow, and where it came from and why we should think about such things today. So in the section on money, he talks about how money almost has a sense of its own. It's not just this inert tool that we can either use for good or for evil, but that there's actually a real allure to it, that it is part of the powers and principalities of this world. That's why Jesus referred to it as mammon, as a master that you serve, rather than just a neutral concept. And he also goes into the extravagances of the prosperity gospel and how that's heretical, but also of the extreme asceticism and how that also falls short of what we see in scripture. And then he talks about ways to behave with money. And one of the big things is he talks about giving. And giving is an act of worship. It's part and parcel of the Christian life. So he says, if we take the biblical witness seriously, it seems that one of the best things we can do with money is to give it away. The reason is obvious. Giving is one of our chief weapons in conquering the god of mammon. Giving scandalizes the world of commerce and competition. It wins money for the cause of Christ. Jacques Ellul has noted, we have very clear indications that money in the Christian life is made in order to be given away. Hence, the guidelines that follow are an attempt to help us in our giving. So then he goes on to give some guidelines, how to think about giving. Some are very practical, some are a little more theological, but the whole idea is that money exists for the Christian to be used for the benefit of the kingdom, to not just feed ourselves and our family, but also to make sure that those around us have what they need as well. That's the purpose of making money if you're a Christian. And it runs completely contrary to the purpose of making money if you're not a Christian. Very much countercultural. The teachings of Jesus on money are diametrically opposed to the teachings of culture on money. And sadly, Christians don't always grasp that, at least theologically. And he does note that there are good uses for money. It's not like you have to shun it and run away from it, but it's like you have to be aware of its power and its allure. And then I like this comparison he makes. He says, money, unrighteous mammon, is poison. And like poison, it's a blessing only when it is used properly and with great care. So there are some things that if you swallow them in large amounts, they'll kill you. But if you give them in small doses, they will heal. Or how the venom of a poisonous snake, I should say a venomous snake, can be used to make antivenom. So you need that poison to make the antidote for the poison. And that's his approach to money that he says should be the Christian approach to money, and what Jesus talks about, using unrighteous mammon for the kingdom. There's a section on children and money, teaching children how to have the proper attitude towards money. He says, we teach them by word and deed that money is neither respectable nor contemptible. We owe money no honor, but neither do we despise it. Money is useful, even necessary, but it is not to be esteemed or admired. In short, we try to show children how to use money without serving money. For example, Luke 16:9, Matthew 6:24. This distinction is difficult to teach children, mainly because so few adults know the difference. We live in an age in which right discipline and control over one's life are so little understood that obsession and abstinence are the only categories that make sense for the modern mind. Either we reject a thing out of hand or we accept it without reservation. This is why dogmatism is so popular today, whether in religion, politics, or economics. So really good, practical, and theologically rich chapter on money. Then we come to part 2, and these are the chapters that have to deal with sex. I'm not being hyperbolic. These 4 chapters are the best Christian writing I've ever read overall on how to approach the concept of sexuality. This book deeply informed the course that we have here at Disciple Dojo, To Know and Be Known, Forming a Thoughtful Christian Sexual Ethic. A good bit of that material was inspired by, if not drawn from, these chapters in Richard Foster's book. Now, there are other great resources out there that have been written about sex and sexuality, so it's not like this is the only one, but this one, these 4 chapters especially, if you don't read the rest of the book, I would say these 4 chapters are worth buying this book to read. They're just that good. He starts with the spirituality and sexuality, the concept of male and female, being naked and not ashamed, that love is to be celebrated. It starts with the positive. It doesn't start with, okay, let's talk about sex. Here's what you shouldn't do. No, it lays the foundation for a biblical, holistic view of sex. Jesus and sexuality, Paul and sexuality, and then the history of sexuality throughout church. Then he gets to distorted sexuality. And this is where he talks about pornography. And I love this section. He says, pornography is a distortion of sexuality. That pornography cannot be defined in absolute terms should not obscure its existence. There is a world of difference between the nude figures in the Sistine Chapel and those in Skin magazine, and any reasonable person knows the difference. Pornography is harmful, says Lewis Smedes, because it makes sex trivial, uninteresting, and dull. Art or literature moves closer to pornography the more it cuts off our sexuality from the full range of human activity and feeling. In pornography, we see a truncated sexuality concerned only with the physical as an activity of lust and a dehumanizing exercise of power over others. Pornographic art cheapens and dehumanizes. True art lifts and ennobles. The sex of the pornographic trade is too slick, too wonderful, too ecstatic. Sex in the real world is a mixture of tenderness and halitosis, love and fatigue, ecstasy and disappointment. When people believe the dream world, they begin to cast a disparaging eye at the flaws of the real world. Indeed, they begin to seek a flawless fantasy world. Such make-believe is genuinely destructive to both true sexuality and true spirituality. And so then he goes on to talk about the concept of lust, because that's linked very closely. And there's a section, homosexuality and the Christian. He deals with same-sex attraction and the difference between acting on versus being tempted by something. And he also talks about that we can't just say, oh, well, it's just something people choose. That there is a fallenness to creation that makes this a deeper discussion. Then chapter 7, he has an entire chapter on sexuality and singleness. As a single Christian, this is life-giving to read. Talks about boundaries in relationships involving sex. He has a section on sexual fantasy. This was a very helpful chapter. Again, this is something a lot of Christians shy away from talking about. But he actually goes in and gives a nuanced discussion of the difference between healthy fantasy, godly fantasy, which everybody has to some degree about something, and sinful lust. And I love how he says it. At the outset, we must make as clear a distinction as possible between lust and sexual fantasy. I say as clear a distinction as possible because we simply must admit that the lines that divide the two are sometimes shrouded in ethical mists and fogs. Although all lust involves sexual fantasy, not all sexual fantasies lead to lust. How do we know the difference? In chapter 6, I defined lust as a runaway, uncontrolled sexual passion. Lewis Smedes has articulated the difference between the two quite well. Quote, when the sense of excitement conceives a plan to use a person, when attraction turns into a scheme, we have crossed beyond erotic excitement into spiritual adultery. Lust is an untamed, inordinate sexual passion to possess, and this is a very different thing from the usual erotic awareness experienced in sexual fantasy. Hence, the first thing that believers should do is to refuse to bear the heavy burden of self-condemnation for every erotic image that floats through their minds. Sometimes sexual fantasies signify a longing for intimacy. At other times, they express attraction toward a beautiful and winsome person. Sexual fantasies can mean many things, and we must not automatically identify them with lust. And he goes on to talk about the concept of disciplining our fantasy. Then there's a section on masturbation. Now, here at Disciple Dojo, one of my most viewed videos, hundreds of thousands of views, is the video where we talk about the ethics of masturbation, and we look at it in depth. And much of that was shaped by how this chapter deals with the subject. If you want to know more, check out that video if you haven't already. Most of you have, judging by the analytics. It talks about passion under control, setting boundaries, that sexual intimacy is supposed to be commensurate with commitment to a person in a relationship. The closer and closer and closer you commit, the more you get until you come to marriage, which is when sexual intimacy is to be fully expressed and explored and celebrated. But how when that's out of line, relationships get distorted and unstable. And there's a section at the end on the single life, the lifelong single life. In chapter 8, sexuality and marriage, there's a great section on celebration in the bedroom. Then he also touches on Christ and divorce and Christ and remarriage. And then the section closes with a chapter on the vow of fidelity, what it means for singles and what it means for married. And then finally, part 3 is the chapters on power. And he talks about the diabolical nature of power and how it's so important to be on our guard against it. And in this section on destructive power, he says, what we must see is the wrongness of those who think they are always right. Jesus Christ alone is always right. The rest of us must recognize our own foibles and frailties and seek to learn from the correction of others. If we do not, power can take us down the path of the demonic. And he says power is insidious when it's coupled with pride. Among the most dangerous people in our media-soaked culture are the leaders who believe their own press releases. And I can't think of anything more apt, especially during an election year, than this. So this section he concludes, he says, when pride is mixed with power, the result is genuinely volatile. Pride makes us think we are right, and power gives us the ability to cram our vision of rightness down everyone else's throat. The marriage between pride and power carries us to the brink of the demonic. Amen. And then he has a section on power in ministry, how this is especially alluring to Christians trying to build their platform and do great things for the kingdom. But he says, actually, it's the ministry of the small things that's truly valuable. The ministry of small things is among the most important ministries we are given. In some ways, it's more important than the ministry of power. The work of power occurs now and again, but the work of small things occurs repeatedly throughout the course of our days. He goes on, small things are the genuinely big things in the kingdom of God. It's here we truly face the issues of obedience and discipleship. It's not hard to be a model disciple amid camera lights and press releases, but in the small corners of life, in those areas of service that will never be newsworthy or gain us any recognition, we must hammer out the meaning of obedience. Amid the obscurity of family and friends, neighbors and work associates, we find God. And it is this finding of God, this intimacy with God, that's essential to the exercise of power. The ministry of small things must be prior to and more valued than the ministry of power. Without this perspective, we will view power as a big deal. Make no mistake, the religion of the big deal stands in opposition to the way of Christ. It's this spirit that leads to the cruelest excesses. It's one of the greatest hindrances today to a free exercise of the ministry of power. When power is seen as a big deal, we want to draw attention to what we have done. We put up our signs and carry on our advertising campaigns in a frantic attempt to show that we are important. The one thing we cannot abide is for this great work of God and ourselves to go unnoticed. How many churches need to hear this? How many YouTubers need to hear this? And so then he ends the book with the last of the vows, the vow of service. The remedy to the temptation of power is in service. And then that's it. So there's a reason why I have bought and given away copies of this book numerous times over the years. Like I said, just the chapters on sex alone are worth this book's full cover price. But Foster has a way of reflecting on things that's not only thoroughly biblically grounded, but also profound in a way that few other Christian writers are able to duplicate. This isn't as well known as Foster's other work, Celebration of Discipline and Prayer. I mean, those have sold probably many more copies than Money, Sex, and Power or its re-release, The Challenge of the Disciplined Life. But I would take this over those any day of the week. So I highly recommend you should read this book. It should be on your shelf. You should wrestle with the concepts in it. Even if you don't agree with Foster's take on everything in it, just the way he approaches it will force you to come to terms with what you do believe, why you believe it biblically, and how you seek to live it out in life practically. That's the benefit of Money, Sex, and Power, or its retitled Challenge of the Disciplined Life. Again, terrible retitle. This is how this book will always be remembered in my mind. But that's all for now. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, I would really, really appreciate it if you do. It definitely helps us out. Stay tuned for more book reviews, more study Bible reviews, more interviews with world-class scholars, more biblical teaching, superhero seminary ridiculousness. All of that is what we do here at Disciple Dojo, and we couldn't do any of it without you and your support. So thank you to each and every one of you. That's all for now. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.